I never thought I would be the kind of woman who caused a scene at a restaurant. I raised my daughter to be strong, to be independent, to trust the man she chose to love. I believed in family. I believed in loyalty. And I believed that when your child looks at you across a candlelit table, with tears of happiness in her eyes, and says, "Mom, I have never been this happy in my whole life," you smile back, squeeze her hand, and let yourself believe it too. But that night, everything I believed was about to be shattered in the span of 60 seconds. By the time dessert arrived, we were already laughing too loud and crying too easily, the way women do when something beautiful is finally happening after years of waiting and hoping and almost giving up. My daughter Serena had been through so much, heartbreak after heartbreak, each one leaving a mark I could see even when she tried to hide it. Dorian Ashcroft, with his tailored jacket and his practiced smile, and the way he had of making every single person in a room feel like they were the only one who mattered. He had swept into Serena's life like a warm front, moving through after a long winter, and she had opened every window and door to let him in. I tried. I want you to know that before anything else. I tried to love him the way she did. I tried to look past the small things that nagged at me in quiet moments. The way his eyes moved around a room, even when he was speaking directly to you. The way he changed the subject whenever I asked about his family, his past, the years before he met Serena. The way he laughed a half-second too late at jokes, as if he were calculating the correct response rather than simply feeling it. I told myself I was being overprotective. I told myself this was just what mothers do when they are terrified of watching their child get hurt again. So when Serena called me 2 months ago, voice trembling with joy, to tell me that Dorian had proposed, I cried with her. I drove to her apartment with a bottle of champagne and a heart full of something that felt almost like relief. Maybe I had been wrong about him. Maybe love had finally arrived for my girl, in the form of this well-dressed, soft-spoken, carefully composed man. And my job now was simply to show up and celebrate. That is what brought us to Rosella's that Friday evening, a small, intimate Italian restaurant in the older part of the city, the kind of place with low lighting and white tablecloths and a violinist who moved between tables like a ghost. Dorian had made the reservation himself. He had ordered a bottle of wine he described as legendary before we even sat down. He pulled out Serena's chair and then mine, smiled at the waiter by name even though it was our first time there, and launched into conversation with the ease of a man who had never once been uncomfortable in his own skin. We were halfway through our main course when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his expression for just a fraction of a second. Not panic, not guilt, something more controlled than either of those things. He folded his napkin, set it beside his plate with the precision of a man who does everything with intention, and said he needed to step outside to take a call. "Business," he said. He apologized to Serena first, kissed her temple, and then walked toward the entrance without looking back. Serena watched him go with a softness in her face that broke my heart a little, because I recognized it. It was the look of a woman who is still slightly amazed that someone like this has chosen her. She asked about my garden. I asked about the apartment they were looking at in the northern part of the city. We shared a bread roll. 3 minutes passed, then 5. I was about to say something lighthearted about long phone calls when I noticed the old man. He was sitting 2 tables away. I had barely registered him when we arrived, the way you barely register the furniture in a room. He was slight, with white hair combed back from a deeply lined face, and he was dining alone. What made me notice him now was that he was no longer eating. He was watching the entrance where Dorian had disappeared, and the expression on his face was something I had no name for in that moment. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. And then he stood up. He moved toward our table with a speed that seemed wrong for his age, urgent and deliberate, and before I could react, he was beside me, one weathered hand passing a folded piece of paper into my palm. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. "Get your daughter out now. Do not wait for him. Do not explain. Just go." And then he straightened up, returned to his table, and placed his napkin back in his lap as if nothing had happened at all. Serena stared at me. Her eyes dropped to the note in my hand and then back to my face. "Mom," she said slowly, "what was that?" I looked at the note. I looked at the door. I looked at my daughter's face, open and trusting and completely unprepared for what was coming. And then I made the choice that saved both of our lives. "We have to go," I said, "right now." She called me paranoid. She said it gently at first, then with an edge. She said I had never given Dorian a fair chance, that I was ruining the celebration, that the old man was probably confused or unwell. I did not argue. I simply stood up, took her hand firmly in mine, and walked her toward the back of the restaurant, the way a mother walks a child away from a cliff edge, steady and certain and not willing to negotiate. We were 12 steps from the rear exit when we heard it. The sound was not an explosion, not at first. It started as something almost ordinary, the way disasters often do. A sharp crack, like a piece of furniture giving way, followed by shouting from the front of the restaurant. Then another sound, lower and more final, that moved through the walls and the floor and up through the soles of my feet, and into my chest, like a fist closing around my heart. Serena stopped walking. She turned toward the noise instinctively the way people do, that terrible human reflex to look at the thing that frightens you. And I tightened my grip on her hand and kept moving. "Mom, stop. What is happening?" Her voice had changed now. In its place was something younger, something that took me back 25 years, to a small girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and press her face into my shoulder. We pushed through the rear exit into the alley behind the restaurant. The night air hit us cold and sharp after the warm candlelight inside. I could hear more commotion now, voices rising, the distinct sound of chairs being overturned, and somewhere beneath all of it, a low mechanical wailing that I would later understand was the beginning of a gas alarm that had been triggered inside the kitchen. But I did not know that yet. In that moment I knew only one thing with absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that bypasses thought and lives somewhere deeper in the body. We needed to be as far from that building as possible. I pulled Serena down the alley toward the street. Whatever she had seen or heard in those final seconds inside Rosella's had dissolved her skepticism completely. She ran beside me in her heeled shoes, one hand gripping mine, the other holding the strap of her bag against her body. We reached the sidewalk and turned left without discussing it, moving away from the restaurant front, away from the growing sounds of panic and the first blue flicker of emergency lights appearing at the far end of the block. We stopped half a block away, behind the shelter of a wide concrete pillar outside a parking structure. Serena bent forward, with her hands on her knees, breathing hard. I kept my eyes on the street, watching the front of Rosella's, waiting for something I could not name. "Mom," her voice was shaking now. "Tell me what is happening. Tell me right now." I opened my hand. The note was still there, crumpled slightly from where I had held it too tight during our run. I smoothed it against my palm and read it aloud in the thin yellow light from the parking structure above us. It said, "He is not who he says he is. The men he called tonight will come through the front. There is a vehicle waiting at the rear for a different reason. Take your daughter and use the kitchen exit, not the alley door on the east side. You have 4 minutes from the time he leaves the table. I am sorry I cannot tell you more here." Serena read it twice. Then she straightened up and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before in 41 years of being her mother. It was not fear. It was not grief, though both of those things were moving beneath the surface. It was the particular devastation of a person watching the entire architecture of their recent life crack down the middle and begin to fall. "Who was that man?" she whispered. "Not yet." What happened next came in waves, the way information always does after a crisis. Fragments arriving out of order that you spend days and weeks assembling into something coherent. The first thing we learned came from a young woman who ran out of the restaurant's front entrance, holding her phone above her head, already recording, already narrating to some invisible audience, the way people do now. She said there had been some kind of confrontation at the entrance. 2 men had come in, asking for someone by name. There had been an altercation. Something had been discharged near the kitchen area and triggered the gas safety system, which automatically shut off the main lines, but not before a flash of heat moved through the service corridor. Nobody died. I want to tell you that clearly, because this story is frightening enough without adding that weight. Nobody died that night inside Rosella's. But 3 people were taken to the hospital. 2 of them staff members who had been closest to the kitchen corridor, and one of them a man who had been seated near the entrance when the confrontation began. The other piece of information arrived 40 minutes later, when we were sitting in the back of a police car parked outside the restaurant, wrapped in those thin silver emergency blankets that make you feel simultaneously safe and completely exposed. A detective crouched beside the open door and asked us a series of questions. I answered as clearly as I could, and then she paused and looked at her notepad, and then back at me with the careful expression of someone deciding how much to say. She asked me how well I knew my son-in-law. I told her what I knew, which turned out to be considerably less than I had imagined. She told me that Dorian Ashcroft, the name he had given Serena, the name on the reservation at Rosella's, the name she had written on the inside cover of the journal she kept on her nightstand, was not the name on his identification when they brought him in. He had been found 4 blocks away, sitting in a parked car, engine running, a bag in the back seat that they were in the process of examining. Serena sat very still beside me. She had not cried yet. She would cry later, privately, in the way of people who need to be alone with the largest griefs. But in that moment, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes focused on some middle distance. And I reached over and covered her hands with mine, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying better. I thought about the old man. I thought about the note. I thought about 4 minutes, and kitchen exits, and the fact that someone had known exactly what was about to happen, and had chosen, for reasons I did not yet understand, to warn a stranger and her daughter rather than walk away. I needed to find him. Before I tell you what I found out about the old man, I need you to understand something about the days that followed that night at Rosella's. Because this story is not just about one dramatic evening and a folded note pressed into the palm of a grandmother at a celebratory dinner. It is about everything that had been quietly assembling itself in the shadows for much longer than any of us realized. It is about the layers underneath a life that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. And it is about what happens when a person you love turns out to be a door that opens into a room you never knew existed and never wanted to see. Serena stayed with me. She did not go back to the apartment she had shared with Dorian for the past 14 months. She could not. The police had asked her not to for the first 72 hours while they processed it. And even after they released it back to her, she stood outside the building, on the sidewalk, for 20 minutes before turning around and coming back to my house without going in. I did not ask her to explain. I simply made up the guest room, put fresh towels on the rack, and left a cup of chamomile tea outside her door each night, the way I used to leave a glass of warm milk outside her bedroom door when she was 7 years old and the world had frightened her. She slept a great deal. She cried when she thought I could not hear her. She called her closest friend, a woman named Priya who had never trusted Dorian either and had the grace not to say so now. She sat at my kitchen table for hours with her laptop open, scrolling through photographs, reading back through messages, holding pieces of the past 14 months up to a new and terrible light, and trying to understand what had been real and what had been performance. I let her do this. I did not hover. I did not offer opinions or analysis or the quiet satisfactions of someone who had sensed something was wrong from the beginning. This was not a moment for any of that. This was a moment for presence, for warmth, for making sure there was always something good-smelling coming from the kitchen, and clean sheets on the bed, and a mother in the next room who was not going anywhere. But while Serena was processing, I was searching. I had described the old man to the detective as precisely as I could. White hair combed back, slight build, deep lines in his face, well-dressed in a dated way, the kind of clothes that were expensive once and had simply never worn out. Dining alone, 2 tables to our left. He had paid his bill before coming to our table because, when the police reviewed the restaurant's records later that evening, his table had already been settled in cash before any of the commotion began. No card, no name, no reservation listed under a traceable identity. He had known he was leaving before the night ended. He had planned his exit the way a careful person plans everything. Quietly, in advance, without leaving edges for anyone to catch hold of. The detective told me, not unkindly, that it was possible I might never know who he was. That sometimes people do good things anonymously, and the anonymity is intentional, protective, for their own reasons that have nothing to do with the person they helped. I thanked her and nodded, and then went home and started looking on my own. I am 71 years old. I know people assume certain things about women my age and technology. They imagine us confused by our phones, dependent on grandchildren to reset passwords, permanently one software update behind the rest of the world. I will tell you what I actually am. I am a retired legal secretary with 40 years of experience finding information that people did not want found, and I have simply transferred those skills to a different set of tools. I am methodical, I am patient, and I do not stop. I started with what I knew about Dorian, not what Serena had told me, which was the version he had constructed for her, but what I could find independently. The name Dorian Ashcroft produced very little, which is itself a kind of information. A person who has lived a genuine life leaves traces. Employment records, social media histories going back years, photographs tagged by other people, an accumulation of digital footprints that are almost impossible to completely erase. What existed went back approximately 3 years, no further, as if the man had been assembled from scratch at that point and inserted into the world, fully formed. The name on his identification when the police brought him in was different. I will not share that name here, not because I am protecting him, but because that name belongs to an ongoing legal matter, and I have been asked by the detective assigned to the case to exercise discretion. What I can tell you is that when I searched that name, carefully and methodically over 3 days at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and my reading glasses, I found a thread. And when I pulled the thread, a great deal came with it. He had done this before. Not identically. The details shifted the way a con adapts to its environment, but the shape of it was the same. A woman, a relationship built with surgical precision over months, a proposal, a celebration, and then, at some point during or after the celebration, a transfer. Of money, of access, of something that varied depending on the target, but always had value. He was not working alone. The men who came through the front entrance of Rosella's that night were associates, and the vehicle waiting at the rear of the building had not been there by accident. What had gone wrong for him that evening, what had disrupted the plan that had presumably worked before, was the old man at the table 2 seats to our left. I found him on the 14th day. It was not through any dramatic investigative breakthrough. It was through the restaurant itself. Rosella's had been in the same family for 31 years, and the current owner, a woman in her late 50s named Marguerite, had been present that evening, and remembered the old man because he was a regular. Not a frequent regular, she said when I called her, but he had come in perhaps 4 or 5 times over the past year, always alone, always the same table, always paid in cash. She knew his first name because she had heard another diner address him once. She thought it was Edmund. She was not certain. Edmund. I wrote it down and stared at it for a long time. And then Serena came downstairs in her robe with her hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger than she had in years, and also older in ways I could not quite articulate. And she sat across from me and looked at the name on my notepad and said quietly, "Who is Edmund?" I looked at my daughter, at the shadows under her eyes, and the steadiness that was beginning to return to her face, slowly, the way color returns to a landscape after a long frost. And I told her everything I had found, all of it, because she deserved the truth, the complete, unedited version, even the parts that were hard to hear. Especially those parts. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "Mom, how did Edmund know we would be there?" I had been so focused on who he was that I had not yet fully sat with that question. But she was right to ask it. Because Dorian had made the reservation. Dorian had chosen the restaurant. Dorian had selected the table, and Edmund, whoever he was, had been seated 2 tables away with a note already prepared, a bill already paid, and 4 minutes counted out to the second. Edmund had not stumbled into that restaurant by chance. Edmund had been watching Dorian, and he had been watching him long enough to know exactly what was going to happen that night before it happened. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a kitchen table when 2 women are sitting with a truth too large to immediately speak around. Serena and I sat in that silence for a long time after she asked her question. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed slowly outside. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and then stopped, as if it too had thought better of making noise. I refilled my coffee. She wrapped both hands around her mug, and then we did what women in my family have always done when the world presents something overwhelming. We started from the beginning, and we worked forward, methodically, together, until the shape of the thing became clear enough to name. We knew Edmund had been watching Dorian. We knew the watch had been close enough and long enough for him to know the restaurant, the evening, the table, and the timeline with precision that could not have been improvised. We knew he had chosen to warn us rather than warn the authorities, which meant either he did not trust the authorities, or warning them was not an option available to him. We knew he had paid in cash, given no traceable name, and disappeared into the night with the practiced ease of someone who had been disappearing for a very long time. Serena suggested something then that I had been circling without landing on. She said, "What if Edmund is connected to Dorian, not as an enemy, as something more complicated than that?" I looked at her. "You mean someone who knew him before?" "Someone who knew what he was before," she said quietly. "Someone with a reason to stop it that was personal." I thought about that for the rest of the day, and the day after. And then on the 16th day after the night at Rosella's, Edmund found us first. I was in my garden in the late afternoon, the light going amber and long, the way it does in that last hour before evening properly arrives, cutting back the dead growth on the rose bushes along the back fence. It is the kind of work I find steadying, physical, and purposeful. The satisfaction of making something dormant look cared for, even in its quiet season. I heard the gate at the side of the house open and close, and I straightened up, expecting Serena returning from the walk she had taken an hour earlier. It was not Serena. He was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps the restaurant lighting had given him a different dimension. In the open air of my garden, he looked slight and careful, dressed in the same dated but well-maintained way I had noticed at Rosella's. His white hair was combed back precisely. His hands, which he held loosely at his sides, were the hands of a man in his late 70s, mapped with veins and age spots, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned over many decades to make no sudden movements. He said, "I owe you an explanation. I have been trying to decide for 2 weeks whether giving you one would help you, or simply open a door better left closed. I have concluded that you will open it regardless, because you are not the kind of woman who leaves doors closed, and it is better that I open it with you than that you open it alone." I set down my pruning shears. I looked at this old man standing in my garden in the amber afternoon light, and I felt no fear. What I felt was something closer to recognition, the sense of finally arriving at a conversation that had been waiting for some time. I said, "Would you like to come inside, Edmund?" He accepted without surprise at the use of his name. We sat at the same kitchen table where Serena and I had been doing our reconstructions, and I made tea. And when Serena came in through the front door 20 minutes later and found an elderly stranger sitting in her mother's kitchen, she stopped in the doorway with her keys still in her hand and simply looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that I can only describe as grief that has been carried so long it has become indistinguishable from the face itself. "You look like your father," he said. "You have his eyes exactly." The keys dropped from Serena's hand onto the floor. Neither of us moved to pick them up. Edmund's real name, the name his mother had given him and the name he had carried through a life of considerable complexity, was Edmund Vasiliev. He was 78 years old. He had been born in a country that no longer existed under that name, had moved through several others over the course of his life, and had arrived in this city 11 years ago under circumstances he described only as necessary. He had spent the better part of those 11 years living quietly, attending the same small church, shopping at the same market, eating occasionally at Rosella's because the owner's father had been a kind man who had once done him a favor he never forgot. And for the past 2 years, he had been watching a man he knew by a different name than the one he had given Serena. A name that connected back through a chain of events stretching across 2 decades and 2 continents to a period in Edmund's life when he had been a different kind of man, doing a different kind of work for people who operated entirely outside the boundaries of anything you or I would recognize as legitimate. He had known Dorian, or rather the man who became Dorian, when that man was young and being trained in the particular skills he would go on to use so effectively. Edmund had been, he told us without self-pity or embellishment, one of the people responsible for that training. He had taught him how to read people, how to build trust systematically, how to construct an identity from nothing, and inhabit it completely. He had believed, in the way that people engaged in morally compromised work always believe, that the skills were neutral, and that the purpose they served was justified by circumstances too complicated for ordinary judgment. He had understood he was wrong gradually, over years, in the way that certain understandings arrive, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of small, unbearable moments that eventually reach a weight you cannot continue to carry. He had removed himself from that world at considerable personal cost, and had spent the years since in the quiet penance of ordinary life, and he had believed, or had tried to believe, that his chapter in that story was finished. And then 2 years ago, he had seen the man he had trained walking into a coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment building, with a beautiful dark-haired woman on his arm, laughing at something she had said, his hand at the small of her back, with a tenderness so perfectly calibrated it was almost impossible to recognize as constructed. Almost. Edmund had recognized it immediately, the way a craftsman recognizes his own work, even when it has been put to uses he never intended. He had confirmed what he suspected. He had wrestled for months with what to do, paralyzed by the knowledge that involving authorities meant revealing his own history, and that his own history was not a simple thing. And then the engagement was announced, and he understood that whatever was being planned was moving toward its conclusion, and that his paralysis had a cost that was no longer abstract. It had a face. It had Serena's face, and it had my face, the face of a mother sitting across a candlelit table from her daughter on what should have been one of the happiest evenings of her life. So he had done the only thing available to him. He had found out the reservation. He had arrived early. He had written the note in his apartment that morning, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside him, trying to compress an enormously complicated truth into the number of words a frightened woman could absorb in 4 minutes. He had watched Dorian leave the table, and he had counted. When Edmund finished speaking, the kitchen was very quiet again. Serena had not moved from the chair she had taken when her legs stopped holding her up. She was looking at her hands in her lap. I was looking at Edmund, and Edmund was looking at the table between us, with the expression of a man who has set down something extraordinarily heavy and is not yet sure whether he feels lighter or simply emptier. Serena looked up finally. Her eyes were dry. Her voice, when it came, was steady in the way of a person who has decided that steadiness is a choice available to them, and has chosen it deliberately. She said, "Did you know my father, Edmund? My real father? Not the story I was told." And Edmund looked at her with those grief-carved eyes and said, "That is a longer conversation. And yes, but I want you to know, before anything else, that whatever complicated things are true about the people who came before you, the fact of you, your life, the woman sitting beside you who walked you out of that restaurant on nothing but instinct and love, none of that is complicated. That part is entirely simple and entirely good." Serena reached across the table and covered his old hand with hers. Outside, the garden was going dark. The roses I had been pruning stood patient and bare along the fence, waiting for the season that would bring them back. And in my kitchen, around a table that had hosted 1,000 ordinary meals and a handful of extraordinary conversations, 3 people who had arrived at each other through the strangest and most painful of roads, sat together in the lamplight and began, carefully and honestly, to tell each other the truth. If you are watching this from somewhere far away, if this story found you on a quiet evening, when you needed to be reminded that instinct is real, and that strangers can be grace, and that the women who love us are sometimes the only thing standing between us and the dark, then leave me a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me your city, your country, your corner of the world. I read every single one. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now. Press that button and the bell beside it, because there are more stories coming. Stories about the extraordinary things that happen inside ordinary lives, told the way they deserve to be told, completely and honestly, and with nothing left out. This community we are building here, story by story and comment by comment, is one of the most beautiful things I've been part of in a very long time. And I am grateful, more than I can properly say, that you are here.